Good morning, students. It's Mrs. Major here. I'm going to be reading Chapter 3, Disrespect, um, from Dear Justice. It's a fairly short chapter, but if you have your book, follow along. If you don't, just listen to me. And because this is an ed puzzle, I'll be stopping throughout my reading to ask you questions. Okay, Chapter 3, Disrespect. Quan was hungry the first time he did it. So were Deja and Gabe. It'd been a good year and a half since Dwight moved in, and Mama hadn't worked in 4 of those months. She said she'd been laid off, but Quan wasn't stupid. He knew one could only take so many sick days before a company decided to tell them to take off permanently. In addition to taking his frustrations out on Mom, the cone had started withholding access to money in response to disrespect. Cone stands for That's Count Olaf A. Negro, a name Quan secretly took to calling Dwight. Anything could qualify. Disagreeing with him in any way, this was the offense Mama was most often guilty of. Moving something from where he'd left it, Quan's cardinal sin, which he couldn't seem to help after years of Mama drilling that everything has a place, and if you take it out, put it back. Even failing to step over the groaning spot in the living room floor when he was watching TV. Quan hated Dwight with every ounce of his being, and Quan couldn't just take Deja and Gabe and leave the house anymore. Dwight suddenly decided he didn't want those daggone kids spending too much time with Delinquent Jr. Clearly, Quan wasn't the only one in the house capable of negative nicknaming. Of course, if Quan disappeared by himself for too long, Dwight also felt disrespected, which is how everything that led up to the first time got started. Mama had applied for assistance. She always said the word like she was trying not to gag on it as it left her throat. And they got a special debit card they would use at the grocery stores. EBT, it was called, Electric Benefits Transfer. Apparently, back in the day, the system involved actually slips of money-sized paper everyone referred to as food stamps. But she made the mistake of sending Dwight to the store with the card on one of the days she was incapacitated, and he'd refused to give it back. It was probably the Olafest thing he'd ever done at the point. He was controlling, conniving, and based on something Quan overheard Dwight say that day, I know you know where that son of a bee was keeping all his ish. Quan was convinced Dwight thought Mama had access to some treasure trove of cash and jewels that belonged to Daddy. We're on page 46 now. He needed a break, Quan did, from the shiver of unease that permeated the whole house like some awful supersonic vibration, from Deja's newfound grownness to Gabe's insistence on being a baby brother barnacle, gluing himself to Quan's side as often as possible, from Mama's anger-cloaked weariness, from Dwight's existence. So he told Mama, who for the first time in weeks wasn't actively healing from a cold encounter, that he was going out. And he headed to his former favorite playground place, stepping over the latest evidence of unsavory activity inside his rocket ship. At least there wouldn't be any babies or diseases. Quan climbed up to the observation deck, largely to hide himself from anyone who might take issue with, make fun of an almost 13-year-old hanging out in the grounded space vessel. But once he got up there, Quan relaxed so much he fell asleep, and by the time he woke up, the sun had gone down. It was a cloudy night, so the streetlights, the ones that worked anyway, were his only source of illumination as he sprinted home. He wished they would all go out, that he could run straight into a darkness so thick and complete it would swallow him whole. Dwight wasn't there when Quan arrived, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. Mama was on the couch, eyes glued to the television, which would have been unremarkable if not for the busted and puffy left side of her mouth and the fact that her left arm was cradled in her lap like she maybe couldn't use it. Quan stopped a good distance away from her. He couldn't figure out what to think or how to feel. Ma? She didn't respond, didn't even shift her eyes from the TV. Quan dropped his own eyes. Ma, I'm sorry, I fell asleep on the playground. Nothing. Quan sighed and forced his feet to carry him to his bedroom, where he knew he was going to find something that would morph the guilt hanging over his head into something solid that would drop down into his shoulders like a cape made of lead. And he was right. His siblings were in his closet. Deja was cradling Gabe, who'd fallen asleep. She wasn't crying, but not 3 seconds after Quan pulled the door open, Gabe's body shuddered with an aftershock from what Quan could only assume was quite the sob session. Great, I can go to my room now, Deja said, rolling her eyes as she shifted Gabe off her so she could get up. Quan knew there was no point in asking her if she was okay. He knew all the attitude was her porcupine skin, her way of letting people know they needed to back the H up. She shoved into his ribs in passing with her bony 8-year-old shoulder, and he took it, absorbed that bit of her anger, and let it throb without making a sound. He knew if he spat out the "I'm sorry" turning sour in his mouth, she would suck her teeth and say something like, "Don't nobody need your whack behind apology." And right then, there was no way Quan could have dealt with how grown up she was. So he scooped Gabe up. Little dude's body shook with another post-cry series of rapid-fire sniffles, carried him to his bed, and climbed in with him. Dwight stayed gone for over a week. Under normal circumstances, this would have made Quan the happiest dude, maybe on all of Earth. But the cone had taken the EBT card with him. He'd also somehow found the minor cash stash Mama kept in one of the shoe boxes on the top shelf of her closet. There'd been a note in its place. "Oh, so you keeping Ish from me? We gonna see about that." First few days, they were okay. They had Hawaiian rolls, half a dozen eggs, quarter jar of peanut butter, 2 TV dinners, and 3 pot pies in the freezer. Day 4, it got tight. Day 5, Deja and Gabe split the final pot pie. Quan didn't eat. Gabe complained that he was still hungry, so Quan gave him the slice of crap pizza he'd smuggled from school. Quan stayed hungry. Day 6, Quan smuggled home 2 slices. And after getting Gabe in bed, Deja plopped down on the couch, turned the TV on, and crossed her arms when Quan said it's time for bed. She was still hungry. Quan left the house. He walked 6 minutes to a corner store he knew was owned by an elderly man who lived in the neighborhood. He'd been there a bunch of times, sent by Mama with 10 in her pocket to grab some milk or hot dogs or jelly when they were on the verge of running out. Wasn't no money in his pocket now, but he went in anyway. The old man smiled and waved at Quan as he entered. Then he excused himself and went to the bathroom, leaving the store wide open to Quan, trusting him. As soon as the door to the storage room shut behind the old man, Quan gulped. He looked left, he looked right. Then he grabbed a loaf of bread and a jar of peanut butter, and he walked out of the store, his first time stealing. Deja cried as she bit into the peanut butter sandwich Quan handed her after waking up. She'd fallen asleep in front of the TV, arms still crossed. Day 7, the cone came back with groceries. And then we're going to go right into the snapshot, and it's entitled Two Boys Not Speaking, 2013. Remember, this is another flashback. It's not that Quan didn't like his cousin Emmanuel. He just didn't know what the heck to say to the dude. They occupied different universes, the boys do, despite being blood. Manny's mama is Quan's mama's older half-sister. From what Quan understands, the 2 women didn't grow up together. His grandfather was apparently a bit of a rolling stone, as Quan's mama put it. And she, Trish, was a product of one of said rolls into a different flower bed. So Quan's mom is the product of his grandfather stepping out on his wife or girlfriend. Granddad stayed with his original family, aka Aunt Tiff. Aunt Tiff is Manny's mom. Quan never called her that. She's never called her anything. And her mom. Tiff hadn't even known Mama. Trish existed until Trish's mama, died, and Tiff Trish's shared daddy had a crisis of conscience and spilled the beans. There was one time Mama had 1 glass of wine too many, and Tiff called to check in. As soon as Mama hung up, she looked at Quan and said, "You ever wonder if my big sis," she'd use her air quotes and everything, "only keeps in touch because she feels guilty about the fact that she had a daddy grown up and I didn't?" Quan didn't answer. He was 8 at the time and had just returned from a weekend at his daddy's house. Anyway, Manny. All Quan really knows is Manny's a year older and they have nothing in common. They accidentally made eye contact once. Quan looked away faster than the speed of light. He's looked everywhere but at Manny since the two boys and their mamas took their seats around the table at this fancy behind restaurant. Quan knows the place is mad fancy because the entire back wall where they're sitting is made of glass, and you can see the smooth surface of a river just beyond it. Ish is always fancy if it's on a river. You really don't have to cover us, Tiffany, Mama says. Nonsense, comes the reply. Aunt Tiff flicks the thought away like some irking insect, and the light catches on the boulder in her diamond rings. 'Cause there's more than one. I haven't seen you in forever, baby sis, Tiff continues. Lunch is the least I can do. And it truly is the least. Quan knows Aunt Tiff and her husband got mega money, that they live out in Oak Ridge, which everybody knows is the most expensive part of Atlanta, that his cousin, he don't have nothing to say to, climbed out the passenger side of a Jag that surely his booty warmers has booty warmers in the seat. What would Manny say if he knew Mama's comment about Tiff not covering them was for show? They barely had food at home, so there's no way in Quan's universe they could afford to eat at this river restaurant. Would Big Ballin' Cuzzo bug out if he knew the real reason Mama's wearing a long sleeved turtleneck dress that goes down to her ankles when it's 83 degrees outside? Quan knows Manny's dad is some financial investment big shot. Does Manny know Quan's daddy is locked up? Quan is sure Manny's eyes would go all big if he knew Quan sometimes stole stuff, that Manny's butt would clench up and all the moisture would leave his mouth with them white behind, straight behind, perfect behind teeth, if he knew that the moment Quan saw the ice on Aunt Tiff's fingers and wrist, his mind started calculating, running through all the stuff he could afford for himself and his siblings with just one of her rings. Quan has never stolen jewelry on anything with value like that before, but still, different universes. The food arrives, sweet potato fries and a lamb burger for Quan, with the fig jam and goat cheese that were supposed to be on it, without the fig jam and goat cheese that were supposed to be on it, because what even is that ish and why would anyone put it on a burger? Asparagus, gross, some creamy white stuff that ain't mashed potatoes, and a hunk of pink fish with the silvery skin still on top for Manny. Salmon, Quan remembers, because Manny ordered it without even looking at the menu. This clearly isn't Manny's first time at the River restaurant, but Quan's 98% sure it'll be Quan's last. Quan sighs. Manny does too, but they don't see each other, and they certainly don't speak.